This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More on them later. Okay, so I want to address the title really quickly. I'm not in this video calling for large swaths of people to be immediately extinguished from the earth. What I am calling for, though, is a change in a system. I know. System change. It's what we do here. It's what we talk about. This video will seek to address why landlordism itself is exploitative, no matter how nice any individual landlord may be. I don't know if it's just me, but I've noticed that there has been a swath of positive landlord content on the internet lately. Not like a huge swath, but I see it popping up here and there. There was something on Twitter that I wasn't able to track down from a few weeks ago. And there's also this Reddit post about this very nice landlord bringing their tenant groceries. So, good for that. But the thing is, I could address that in a particular way. I could say, hey, those are positive examples that seem to be pushed as a type of propaganda paid for or supported by the landlord class and people who support the landlord system, and then cite you all these different examples of bad landlords doing bad things. And I'm not going to do that.
That complex sent a bill to the family of one of its former tenants, charging them because they say she broke her lease when she died.
Saws, threats, false police reports. This is how far Kip and Nicole Macy went to try to get their tenants to move out.
I sent a client to a property that was asking $13,000 a month. He offered $20,000 a month because there were so many people at the house. He offered to pay 6 months in advance, and the landlord came back and asked for $23,000 a month.
That's not really what's important. People's experiences with landlords as individuals will vary greatly. As bad as many of them may be, as good as some of the exceptions may be. The problem is, again, landlordism itself. Really, a person who is a good landlord, as we might consider, and examples like the one from Reddit, are people who I would argue are not actually good landlords. They're being good people, they're doing good actions, while still being landlords. In actuality, if you're going to be a good landlord in the sense of being effective at that job, that would require you to not do stuff like that as often. What does this mean? What am I getting at? Let's talk about it. So I've been working on this blog where I talk about music that I like, because that's something that I used to do a lot more than I do now as a YouTuber. And in particular, I'm writing about this album by Nala Sinefro called Endlessness, which was probably my favorite album of last year. And I'm able to do it with this platform called Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform. Whether you're just starting out or you're managing something quite big like a growing brand, Squarespace makes it very easy to build a beautiful website and create a community with your audience. I found the experience with Squarespace great so far. They have a notable amount of great design tools which are super easy to use and allow me to make the website look a lot cooler than I'd be able to on my own. They also have new features like Squarespace Payments, which allows you to give customers on your website, if that's something you choose to do, the ability to pay with things like Klarna or Apple Pay. So if you're interested in getting started in building a website, go to squarespace.com/ElliottSang, that's code ELLIOTSANG, to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring, and let's get back to it.
Rent! Hi.
So what is a landlord's job? A landlord's job is to make as much income as possible from the land and property that they own. So in case you're not sure why that's bad, let's check the context. Despite Gen Z allegedly outpacing other generations in home ownership, prospects in the housing market seem unpromising for folks under 30. 2024 was the slowest year for the US housing market in 3 decades, according to a December piece from the New York Times. Forecasts for the year to come only see price increases. And yet, as addressed in our work on homelessness and in parallel with our work on the healthcare system, housing is a fundamental human right. I mean, that's at least what the United Nations says, but who listens to the United Nations anyway, right? Though tracking such a number is A near impossible task, especially given our current systems of counting homeless. Again, see our video on homelessness from earlier in January. Current reporting from the Department of Housing and Urban Development states that homelessness was at a record high in the US alone in 2024, a number which keeps shooting up every year. Many more people are housing insecure, which includes, as written by Leopold et al. For the Urban Institute, housing cost burden, residential instability, evictions and other forced moves, living with family or friends to share housing costs, doubling up, overcrowding, living in substandard, poor quality housing, or living in neighborhoods that are unsafe and lack access to transportation, jobs, quality schools, and other critical amenities. So, let's do a thought exercise. Let's say we're watching a movie. Okay, a Disney movie. How about we sweeten the pot there? I know that y'all like your Disney movies. It tells a story of a massive land, of great inequality and injustice. And in that land, there are millions of people who are struggling to have housing. And there is a small percentage of very rich people in that land who control most, if not all, of the housing there, as well as a bunch of other fairly well-to-do people who are not quite as rich as those rich people, but essentially parrot their ideas, support them, and have their own pieces of land and housing, which they are making very difficult for other people, the people in desperate need of it, to have it. Those people would be the villains, right? Those people would be the villains in that story. And I hear many of you saying, that's not a fair depiction. Obviously, life is more complicated than a Disney movie. Landlords are not necessarily villains at all. They're just people who made a significant investment in some land and housing, often very savvy investment that took time to think about, and they're just trying to get a proper return on that investment. Now, it is true that in real life, things are a bit more complicated than in a Disney movie and in that example I gave you. But I want to make sure I address the fact that in a lot of cases, it is that simple, or very, very close to that simple. I mean, time and time again, we get stories, anecdotes from people in our lives, on social media, on the news, about landlords being low down and dirty people. And that's not a coincidence. For today's purposes, we will turn our attention to the UK, but many of these UK examples and analyses are relevant to other countries. In recent years, the UK was one of many countries which saw landlords worried over their profits screw vulnerable people who had suddenly become unemployed, sick, or maligned otherwise. Here's a quote from a piece called Abolish Landlords from a couple years back by Jamie Medwell for Jacobin. Guaranteed shelter afforded to hundreds of thousands of renters by the COVID-19 eviction ban has now come to an end. In its wake comes a rising tide of eviction and homelessness. If a recent string of interviews exposing the derangement of the rentier class is anything to go by, it's a moment over which landlords have been salivating. Over the past 2 weeks, they have gleefully issued 400,000 tenants with eviction notices. We will be looking at Against Landlords by Nick Bano for insights on how the UK became so dominated by landlordism against the interests of the public. So first, I'm going to bring up a story that Nick Bano shares early on in the book about one such victim of this phenomenon during the COVID-19 pandemic. In April 2020, a few weeks into the COVID-19 pandemic, Anna, a member of the direct action casework group Housing Action Southwark in Lambeth, was living in a flat with her husband and children in South London. Anna's landlord belonged to a particular group of private landlords who source their tenants from local councils' homeless populations, letting out housing that is generally of poor quality and often setting the rent by reference to universal credit levels. Like almost everyone who rents privately in England and Wales, Anna held an insecure assured short-hold tenancy, which had by law been the default arrangement for private tenants since 1996. Anna and her partner worked, but their shifts were sporadic and unreliable, and their wages were low, so they were also entitled to universal credit. Most of this went straight to their landlord. Universal credit is payouts from the government. Unsurprisingly, Anna's landlord soon found out that the housing benefit rates had gone up. Anna was on a rolling tenancy. Her initial 12-month tenancy had expired but continued on a month-to-month basis, and the landlord contacted the family with a proposal. He suggested that he should grant them a new year-long tenancy at a higher rent, the increase being exactly the same as the additional amount of housing benefit that the government had just announced. The landlord wanted this new free money that the state was offering, and he wanted it right away. A measure that was supposed to reduce poverty and prevent evictions ended up simply converting welfare spending into even greater profits for a buy-to-let landlord. At the same time, Anna's case exposes just how direct the state's role is in driving the housing crisis. The rise in universal credit increased the value of Anna's home because, with a rise in the amount the average benefit recipient household could pay in housing costs, the flat could now attract a higher market rent. It both immediately paid the landlord a better monthly income and raised the value of that particular home as an asset, because it could now generate more rent in the future for anyone who wanted to buy it. So not only did this landlord take the money that was being given to this housing insecure tenant from the government, but this is such an important and normalized part of the process in the UK that it's part of what brings rents up. And that's how rents work. When rents go up, they go up and they stay there because as long as you're able to charge people a certain amount for rent, you will. That's a landlord's job. So here's some statistics from Against Landlords showing the nature of the crisis and how well things are going over there in the UK. In 2023, the UK had the highest proportion of homeless households in the OECD. It is the only member state in which the figure exceeds 1%. In 2022, there was not even one region in England where the average rent was affordable to a single woman on median earnings. Seems like a good sign. On average, the poorest 20% of private renters surrender more than half of their income to their landlords. Why wouldn't the landlords just do something about that? That seems wrong. Because it's their job. Renters are paying more for less. Average floor space per person has shrunk from 43 square meters to 36 square meters over the past 20 years. Getting as much bang for your buck as possible, am I right? Almost 20% of privately rented homes are thought to be in a hazardous condition. Social housing providers face a chronic lack of resources to carry out repairs, leading to an endemic of damp and mold and other forms of disrepair. So this is what leads to the market being the way that it is. If you've been in the process of looking for a new home to buy or rent, if you've just searched through Zillow.com for rentals or buying properties in a certain area you'd like to move to just as like a dream, you'll notice that the prices are high and getting higher and higher over time. Here's a chart. You guys like charts, right? Tracking the average house sale price in the US over 60 years or so. Notice the stark impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Look how much housing got more expensive in a time where people were as vulnerable as ever. The more vulnerable people get, though, the more you can charge them for housing. We're taught to think that housing is something that sets a foundation for rent. That's the biggest thing, of course, is to buy a house, but if you can't, you rent. And that because housing is becoming more valuable, of course, rent has to go up as well. But it's not really like that. It's kind of the opposite. Rent prices go up. And so housing prices go up. Because what is a housing price in the first place? Let's think about it. For one, landlords are obviously the beneficiaries of that rent increase. And this is what happens when the state reneges its duty to provide good housing for citizens. Housing becomes a highly profitable private asset. Public housing projects get abandoned. Their air rights are sold to private investors under the guise of this being the only way that the housing can get necessary repairs. And this is also how you get massive corporate landlords, which is something that people have been talking about a lot recently, about Blackstone and how many properties it owns around the world. Where did that really begin as a phenomenon in the housing market? So you remember 2008? From Urban Warfare by Raquel Rolnick. Broadly speaking, large financial investors entered the rental housing market after the bursting of the real estate bubble of 2008, seizing the opportunity to buy those so-called toxic assets on the cheap. Known as vulture investors, global financial conglomerates bought devalued assets in order to transform them into a new market frontier, infiltrating territories that had been neglected by or protected from them. Since 2008, in the United States, private equity funds have bought foreclosed homes repossessed from indebted families. That's right, if you know somebody who lost their home in 2008, if you were that somebody, those homes went on to be bought at a cheap price by rich corporations and are now shooting through the sky in their value. They took advantage of that situation. So I just wanted you to know that because I'm sure that makes you feel a lot better about it. But it was only in 2011 that some of the biggest private equity funds that invest in real estate, such as Blackstone or Colony Capital, decisively entered the business. They set up affiliates that have accumulated thousands of housing units, especially in the cities most devastated by the mortgage collapse. For instance, today Blackstone owns 82,000 units in 17 US markets. Please remember this book came out in 2019, so numbers have changed. According to a report published by a civil organization in defense of the right to housing in Atlanta, the housing stock owned by private equity funds in the United States amounted to 200,000 units in 2013. That's 12 years ago. That's a long time. That number is a lot bigger now.
The wildfires have created a much bigger housing crisis in LA as people out of their homes now have to look for somewhere to stay.
Earlier today, I spoke with a housing expert at USC named Marco Giacoletti. I asked him about the prospect of a rent freeze in LA County, as some consumer advocates are calling for. He said that could be counterproductive because it could limit our supply if landlords stop bringing properties to the marketplace, and that could just exacerbate the problem. But the most interesting element of my conversation with Mr. Giacoletti was when he talked about the possibility of, as we start rebuilding, starting to relax some of the zoning laws, especially in a more working class neighborhood like Altadena, so that rather than putting up single family residences, especially on parcels where people might not have the wherewithal to rebuild at all, we allow developers to start putting up duplexes and apartments. In other words, increasing density, but also increasing more housing. And it reminds me in Gone with the Wind when we had the carpetbaggers showing up for reconstruction. We're going to see the same thing here. Right.
It just feels grossly opportunistic.
And I'm sure that these corporate landlords would never do something like, colluding with one another to drive up rent prices all at once. I'm sure they would be very receptive to their new tenants in many cases and their needs in terms of maintenance and community rule following, right? The reality of corporate landlordism seems newer, though, than it actually is. This phenomenon of housing being an asset, a financial thing, instead of a basic human right, is not a new phenomenon. It's something that extends to the beginnings of capitalism and before. As Bano writes, there is a common complaint that housing has moved from a basic need to a financial asset. But a Marxist understanding would be that under capitalism, housing has always been a financial asset. It is a thing that everyone needs, which tends to be withheld from us unless we can meet a certain price, and in this sense, it has always been commodified. Now you see why I'm doing this video after the healthcare video. As a matter of fact, this housing regime is a holdover from feudalism. Where do you think that the archaic term landlord comes from? So this is a really important historical passage here from Bano. Early capitalism was concerned with landlords' rights to extract ever more value from agrarian land, and that agricultural dimension has been the focus of much historical and theoretical debate. But the development of agrarian land rights and practices also had knock-on effects on housing. As the value of domestic agriculture went into decline, largely due to the successes of colonialism in producing wealth abroad, and as the mass of working people became increasingly large, urban, and propertyless, the importance of the housing aspect of land rights increased. Increasing amounts of both land and people were encompassed by the principles of commodification. Housing, along with everything else, was exposed to all of the various crises and contradictions of capitalism itself. But the principles of housing supply began to change in the 1630s with the signal event in the commodification of homes, the granting of government permission for the development of 2 new residential squares in London, one at Covent Garden, the other at Lincoln's Inn Fields. In both cases, the landowners succeeded in petitioning King Charles I for lawful permission to produce a small district of modern houses, not for themselves, nor even for anyone in particular, but for the sole purpose of selling them for profit. In other words, the houses were produced for exchange, they were commodities, and that process was now sanctioned by law. Both projects were successful enough despite the interruption of the Civil War, and that success was enhanced by the return of the monarchy in 1660, which arrived with new ideas from the continent on how the super rich might live. These early experiments in high living sparked a spree of urban property development and speculation that has never really stopped. Okay, time for everybody's favorite part of the Elliot Sang video. What can we do about it? I think the way to address this, other than Just casually mentioning the passage in Nick Bano's book talking about the early 20th century riots in Scotland that forced landlords to stop hiking rents and arresting people for not being able to pay them on time despite the rent being taken out of their paychecks. That was an agreement they came to. That was cool. I want to talk about a personal story. Not mine, but the personal story of a friend of mine. Video essayist and friend of the channel, Dr. Fatima, has recently been in a situation in which she's experienced some housing insecurity and a really difficult situation with a landlord from hell.
So I can't get into the details of it for legal reasons. What I can say with like a lot of clear confidence is my landlord tried to force me out of my home for selfish reasons, let's say, like not on the basis of me like somehow being a horrible tenant, but just because they wanted to. That's like a thing I've often heard. I live in the Bay Area. Housing here is really cutthroat, and I've heard many a story of people getting evicted for absolutely no reason and pushed out of their housing just because the landlord wants to move back into the property, or the landlord wants to raise the rent, or the landlord wants to do something, and the fact that they've like rented out the unit is getting in the way of that. So I was kind of in this kind of situation of landlord attempts to reclaim their property because they want it. That's been going on for like 2 months now. It kind of like peaked and came down, but I'm still dealing with aspects of it, and I will likely be dealing with aspects of it for months to come. But yeah, my landlord illegally tried to evict me. And at first I was gonna leave because I was scared. And then at some point I learned what my rights were and that I didn't have to leave. And so I've insisted upon staying. But even though that's the case, exercising those rights has been difficult and exhausting and taking immense amounts of work and time and energy, and just really run me down like emotionally and psychologically.
This took place during Thanksgiving.
This is 100% personal. Like they basically waited until I made like a small error in something that completely does not warrant eviction, and they tried to frame that thing as being an easy basis to kick me out after they've been like holding on to this resentment for over a year. So like as soon as there was like a slight miscommunication, they just kind of like pounced on it as an opportunity to finally like get me out. I got a 3-day notice to quit, which means you got to leave your home the week of Thanksgiving. If it was, you know, not an empty threat, I would have had to be out of the house on Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. And if I wasn't, the eviction would have been processed on the following Friday. I had like canceled trips to go see family and friends. I spent Thanksgiving alone in my home the day after I should have left, waiting for the next day to see if I was going to be evicted. And I remember very distinctly just like being so wildly anxious that whole night. Every time I heard somebody pass by my front door, I like would get a mini panic attack because I thought it was somebody coming to like post the notice. And I was kind of in that position of not knowing whether or not they were going to go through with this improper eviction for like 10 days. Like 10 days, I was just like waiting. Like, am I going to have somewhere to live tomorrow? And it was horrible. Would not recommend.
Something that Dr. Fatima also was careful in noting is that though she's been able to work through her process, thanks to the fact that she has academic training and thus training in doing research and parsing through difficult documents, as well as good friends around her, this is something that is quite difficult for even someone like her to fight against.
Tenant laws where you live might be stronger than you think, regardless of what is presented to you by a landlord potentially trying to make you leave. There is likely information that could like support you. However, even if you're in a place with really robust tenant laws that make it very clear that what a landlord is doing is illegal, exercising those rights is extremely difficult. Like it is a non-trivial thing, even if the law is extremely clear, if what happened is extremely straightforward, if you have complete awareness of all of that, even then it can be really, really hard to actually have those things be enforced. For one, you have to know that they exist, because landlords can just lie to you, right? Landlords can say you did something wrong when you didn't. They can also put things that are illegal in your like leases or rental contracts. There was a good amount of time where like I thought I had no case because of something in a rental agreement. And it turned out that the thing in the rental agreement contradicted the law. And in a case like that, the law supersedes a rental agreement. You can't have someone sign away their rights unknowingly, right? So I spent a while thinking, oh, I don't have a case here. I don't have any rights. This is like a technicality that I could actually be evicted over. That's the information that was presented to me based on like what my landlord told me and like what was in our rental agreement. But when I did research and looked at the laws, what I was presented and what was in the law completely contradicted, and the law supersedes. So I first didn't even know that I had a case, right? So I didn't know that there were even laws to protect me. When I got that 3-day notice, I had a bunch of people come over to my house and we just had a research party and we just all sat on our laptops, like looking at stuff, sharing information, trying to figure out what's what, cross-referencing, putting immense amounts of manpower into simply understanding the law, like learning that it was there, learning how it applied, understanding it, applying it to my situation. That took so much time and effort from a lot of extremely competent people just to know that there were laws protecting me, right? If I did not have my people around me, I would not have been able to deal with this. By which I mean, not that I would have been on the street or something. I think what I would have had to do was just leave and within a couple days find somewhere else to live and like deal with the mess of finding somewhere to live on extremely short notice and having to leave my home and things like that.
So what are the things that helped Dr. Fatima in this situation? What are the things that she wants us to know in terms of what we can do, not only to help ourselves and our friends when they encounter these situations, but also to be in solidarity with other people we don't even know who are experiencing similar things?
First is learn about and potentially join your local tenants union. These exist in a lot of places. It's like unions for jobs, except where you live, and they can be a great source of information and resources and people to help you and so many things. You know, makes a lot of sense if we're gonna organize in our workplaces or organize in whatever other context. It makes sense to organize as renters as well. And this is the kind of thing that if you go join a tenants union, you will have knowledge and connections that if then one day a friend hits you up and say something's happening to them with their housing, you can be like, oh, I got some people you should talk to. I got some references to send you. I have like some knowledge, right? That's like a good thing to be a part of. Something I wouldn't have expected about this experience is like the significance of psychological warfare and the purely mental battle that it is to when somebody who has power over you tries to wield that power over you, to not just submit to it right away, right? Because that's the instinct. That was my instinct. So I was just like, I guess I gotta leave. And that is exactly the point, right? They're trying to scare you. They're trying to scare you into not asserting your rights and not defending yourself.
So let's close with talking a little bit about tenants unions. Join your local tenants union. That's it. That's the end of the program. Join your local tenants union / renters union. That's basically the biggest piece of advice I have for you. If you'd like me to do a separate video talking about what renters unions and tenant unions do, I would be happy to do so. Just feel free to request it. I could even talk about unions overall, and that sounds like a fun project. So again, just let me know if you'd be interested in that. Thanks again for watching. If you'd like to support the channel and help steer me more and more into a direction where I can be financially independent without working with sponsors, check out my Patreon, in which I upload interviews with content creators like FD Signifier, Noah Samson, Zoe B, and more. And yeah. I don't know if I should say anything else. Bye.